Hey gang, welcome to week 3, REL 2502, Jesus' death and resurrection. And you might can tell from my voice that I'm not feeling 100% today, which is probably good news for you because I'm fairly motivated to keep this short. So I will do the best I can to do that. I do have my little caffeine to help me out, so hopefully that'll get me through it. But yeah, sorry about the froggy voice. I'm better now than I was, but still not quite there yet. So as the rain is falling, though, let's go ahead and get this thing knocked out. All right, so housekeeping, a lot of the same stuff, really. Reflection questions, quiz questions, church visitations coming up. How are you doing with that? I haven't gotten that many emails. So again, my assumption, you're going to hear me say this a lot, since I'm not getting very many emails, my assumption is that everyone's fine, understand what's expected, all systems go. So if that's not the case, then, let me know. Or also, you don't have to just let me know if there's a problem. If there's just something on your mind that you need to talk about or a question that you had, you can always just shoot me something on that too. I certainly don't mind. Actually, I would welcome that. So do it if you feel compelled to. Okay, so we're talking about Jesus' death and resurrection today. Last week we talked about his life, the world he stepped into, basically a world that was itching for revolution, itching for rebellion. Somebody lead us against the Romans, and Jesus says, that's not what I'm about. My prospects are bigger than that. And how the bulk of his teaching centers around this idea of the kingdom of God. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do the healings relate to that? And demon exorcisms, raising the dead, parables, how do all of these things relate? He's not take up a sword, get in front of the people and lead. There's even, if you read the Gospels, there's even something called the Messianic secret. Like, if you might have noticed this, if you've read Gospels before, where Jesus will do something and somebody will say, I'm going to go tell everyone about this. And he says, no, don't be shouting it. Just kind of keep it to yourself. Scholars call that the Messianic secret. And it's kind of a weird thing. It's like, why would Jesus say, if the ultimate goal is the worldwide, think about the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, like, go, take my message across the world. Why at this point in the story does he say, no, don't tell anybody about what I did? Unless, it's interesting, because and this is a bit of a digression, but I promise it'll make sense. When Jesus is in Gentile territories, when he's speaking to a predominantly Gentile audience, he's much more relaxed. He's like, go, tell people, that's a great idea. But when he's speaking to Israelites, when he's speaking to people in the nation of Israel, it's very, very hush-hush. And again, the reason for that is this notion of public perception. If word gets out what he can do, they're going to push him to the front of the crowd. They're going to put a sword in his hand. They're going to say, lead us. They're going to preempt him from the mission that he truly had as the Gospels presented it. So you have this motif then of the Messianic secret, which the Gospel writers have, particularly Mark, have Jesus going, no, keep quiet. It's not time yet. It's not ready yet. Well, what is he waiting for? Well, he's waiting for his death and resurrection. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and how that works itself out. Now, you probably know this already, but the traditional understanding of Jesus' death is that it's salvific. What does that mean? That means that it has a redemptive purpose. It has a purpose related to salvation. Some have even said that the primary purpose of Jesus' life was to die. And if you don't believe me, there's some lyrics from a hymn by a Christian author. I cannot talk. This is going to be a fun lecture. I don't know what I'm going to say. There's some lyrics by an artist named Michael W. Smith, Christian artist. I wrote a song called Above All, and the chorus of that song goes, I'm not going to sing it, crucified, laid behind the stone, you lived to die, rejected and alone, like a rose trampled on the ground, you took the fall and thought of me above all. So again, that phrase, you lived to die. It almost like the first 30, if Jesus, in tradition, the tradition tells us Jesus was 33. It's almost like the first 32 years and 51 weeks of his life are kind of second, they're relevant. They play second fiddle to the last week of his life and specifically to his death. And you even see this reflected in the Gospels itself. Like if you've ever read Mark, or if you read Mark for this class, or if you've read it on previous occasions, did you notice that the whole second half of the Gospel is the last week of his life? So the whole first half of the Gospel is everything leading up. The whole second half of the Gospel is the last week of his life. Martin Kaler was a New Testament scholar. He said the Gospel of Mark, I'm quoting him here, he says, it's a passion narrative with an extended introduction. So it is really all about that passion. It is really all about that process of suffering that culminates in his death. It's a fundamental importance. Again, this is the traditional understanding, the traditional viewpoint, which still holds in a lot of evangelical, well, not just evangelical, but in a lot of conservative situations. The predominant amount of attention, well, I mean, think about the holidays. You don't see any holidays that are related to the active events in his life. You see holidays related to his birth. You see holidays related to his death. And his resurrection, which we'll get to. So yeah, it's interesting. So that's the traditional one. Wright is going to tweak that, but he's going to uphold basically that structure. Borg is a little different. By the way, this lecture is exclusively about Wright and Borg because I thought their chapters on this were phenomenal. Really, really interesting, really, really helpful. And they paint just a beautiful contrast, which I find very helpful in teaching this material. So it's going to be a lot of Wright and Borg today. So Borg sees things obviously very differently. The first big question Borg asks is, did Jesus himself see his mission in this way? Did he have a mindset of, I'm going to die, and through that death, the world is going to be saved? Wright says basically yes. Borg says basically no. The earliest Christian communities interpreted his death this way. So after the fact, they looked back on his death and said, you know what, that right there was what set everything in motion for us. That was what allowed for salvation to happen. Now, on one hand, I mean, you have to, even if you're a traditional evangelical, even if you're a traditionalist in this sense, you have to admit there's an air of plausibility to that. I mean, think about it. The Gospels themselves indicate that the disciples were unprepared for the very idea of Jesus' death. It blew their minds. Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. In the Gospels, Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. We're going to go here, and at this point, this is what's going to happen. I am going to get taken up. I'm going to die. And the disciples are not ready for that. They can't even comprehend that. It just completely goes over their head. So if you think about that, and you go, all right, you think about someone like Peter, who was unprepared for this, watches Jesus die. There is an air of plausibility to the suggestion that he goes back after the fact and says, this was the worst thing that ever happened. Well, how can we find any type of silver lining? How can we find any type of hope in what would otherwise be utter despair? I mean, these people, the Gospels say that these followers dropped everything. They left their entire lives behind to go follow Jesus, and now he's dead. What are we supposed to do with that? You can see why someone like Borg, who, when it comes to physical resurrection, he's a skeptic, as we'll see. You can see why someone like Borg would go, okay, that makes sense. He didn't see he didn't see his mission inherently wrapped up in dying, but as a way to not save face. That's not the right way to put it, but as a way to try to rescue some hope from what would otherwise be an awful situation. The earliest Christian community said, yes, that's the reason. He had to die for our salvation. And that's how we take this awful situation and we make it a little bit better. So it's an interesting thought. I think there's an air of plausibility to it. Again, not everyone's going to hold that view. The traditionalist certainly isn't. But that's where Borg's coming from. Now, the reason he thinks this way, he lays out the evidence for his argument, the basis of his belief here. And he hammers on a couple of things, which I think are really interesting. Number one, the nature of prophecy. He says, when you talk about prophecy, when you talk about things in the Hebrew Bible that seem to relate to Jesus, like Isaiah 53, some of these other passages, the suffering servant passages. Was that a case of Jesus, the writers noticing that the life of Jesus fulfilled these prophecies, or was it a case of the New Testament writers after the fact putting together their story of Jesus in such a way that it checked the boxes of these Old Testament prophecies? Was it truly prediction, or was it making the historical narratives check the boxes of these prophecies, fitting the historical narrative to match these prophecies? He's skeptical. He tends to lean towards the latter, honestly. Whereas, again, and the reason I love this book for this class is because you get both sides of the fence portrayed just beautifully here. Because the traditionalists say absolutely not. Jesus fulfilled those prophecies in his being, and the gospel writers just recorded what they saw and what they knew from the Old Testament. So somebody like Matthew in particular is every other sentence. This was in accordance with this prophecy. This was in accordance with this prophecy. A lot of that has to do with who Matthew was writing to. But someone in Borg's position, a non-traditionalist position, is going to say, well, you can't really say that Jesus is who he said he is because he fulfilled all these prophecies. It's more of a case of the New Testament authors when they're putting this tradition into words, saying, hey, let's make this guy look really impressive, and let's make his story match the Old Testament scriptures that we already had. Do you see the distinction there? Obviously, how you view prophecy is going to really influence how you view a lot of the rest of it. Do you believe in the supernatural or not? But the traditionalist believes in the miraculous here, believes in the sense of these things were said hundreds of years before, and Jesus fulfilled all of them. Whereas the more skeptical position says, come on, I mean, the odds of that happening are minuscule. It suited the purpose of the authors to frame Jesus' story in this way. So you have that, a striking difference there. You also have what I call aesthetic reasons. And there's a passage, and I'm going to do this a few times today. There's a passage which I thought was really striking. And you can find it on page 82 in Borg's chapter here. And I'm just going to read it. He says, honesty compels candor. I find this, that Jesus knew he was going to die, not only a strange notion, but an unattractive notion to attribute to Jesus. I don't want Jesus to have seen his own death as having the significance Tom gives to it. As a Christian, I want Jesus to be an attractive figure. Obviously, wanting Jesus to be attractive cannot be a criterion for making historical judgments, and I must factor this desire into my historical judgment, not only about this matter, but about every other historical decision I make about Jesus. Excuse me. Wow. Basically, he says, I don't think it's true because it would be an unpleasant truth. It's a pretty striking admission. But my question is, and it's a question for you, and it might end up being your discussion question this week, we'll see. Why do you think Borg sees this traditional understanding that Jesus knew that he had to die in order for the plan to work? Why does Borg see this as quote-unquote unattractive? Why does it diminish his perception of Jesus if Jesus really did believe this about himself? I'm having a hard time seeing it. I don't know if he thinks it's morbid. I don't know if he thinks it's like backwards or naive. I'm not sure where Borg's coming from there, but it's pretty striking that he basically admits one of the reasons that I don't believe in this in this argument is that if it were true, it would kind of leave a bad taste in my mouth as it relates to Jesus. So it's interesting. The next argument that he puts down, though, I find a heck of a lot more persuasive. And he says, an overriding emphasis on Jesus' death downgrades his life and downgrades his accomplishments. And there's something to this, because I grew up evangelical. Some of you are probably evangelical. I think it's safe, and you can challenge me on this if you disagree, but I think it's safe to say that there's a healthy, almost overwhelming influence, or focus rather, on Jesus' death and resurrection in conservative Christianity. To the extent where all of the other stuff, the social teaching, the healing, kingdom of God stuff, kind of gets pushed to the background. And it's interesting because in more liberal environments and more mainline progressive environments, it's reversed. The overriding focus is on Jesus' life and how he elevated the marginalized and how he spoke to the oppressed classes, and the stuff that he did while he was alive. And the last week of his life gets pushed to the background. So it's very interesting. You can see different focuses here depending on your theological persuasion. I grew up in an evangelical background in which the last week of Jesus' life and the death and resurrection were basically object of conversation when it comes to Jesus, basically the object of conversation, I would say 90% of the time. Like maybe we talk about his birth, maybe we talk about his baptism, maybe we talk about some healings, but for the most part, we're talking about atonement, we're talking about salvation, we're talking about everything that springs from his death and resurrection, basically. But again, mainline churches see it differently. I think there's a balance to be struck, but I think Borg is right to worry that if you put all of that focus on the death and resurrection of Jesus, it does run the risk of, what about the other really revolutionary things that he did while he was alive, while he was actually teaching, while he had a teaching ministry? That gets downgraded. It just does. He lived to die. Well, what about the healings? What about the exorcisms? What about the teachings? What about the people that he touched? What about the women and the folks that were and the Gentiles and the oppressed, marginalized folks that he ministered to? What about them? So I think that one's a lot more, in my mind, that one's a lot more persuasive than I just find the notion of Jesus' death icky, which is what the second one feels like to me. Again, it's obnoxious to sip your coffee. I'm so sorry, but otherwise I'm not sure if I'm going to make it through it, so I apologize for that. He also raises textual questions, which I think are interesting. He said, for example, you have the accounts of the Gospels put Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying, distraught, sweating blood in some accounts. Borg asks a simple question: how did the Gospel writers know that? Who told them? Or what about the trials that the Gospel writers wouldn't have had access to? Who told them what happened? Is it really plausible to think that they got a report on these events and relayed that report, or is it more plausible to think that they fabricated these events to fit the narrative gaps in the story? Borg, obviously, Wright is going to answer that critique, but Borg's position is, look at Jesus sweated blood. How do we know this? The disciples were asleep. How do we know this? They didn't see it. Who told them? Did Jesus make time as he was in the process of being killed to say, hey, this happened the night before? It's an interesting question that Borg raises, for sure. So you're looking at all this stuff where Borg is being skeptical. Borg is being, I don't believe it happened the way the Gospel said that it happened. He mentioned in his very first chapter at last week's reading that he's the guy who says, well, it probably didn't happen that way. So he's doing a lot of that here. So what does he accept? He accepts that in the last week of Jesus' life, he ran into heavy controversy with the Pharisees and the religious teachers. He says that's plausible, that makes sense, that fits his description of Jesus as a social teacher who had a penchant for reaching out to the oppressed and for pissing off the comfortable and the affluent. He accepts that. He accepts the Last Supper. Some sort of meal happened with Jesus and his disciples. He doesn't accept the ritualistic nature of it, per se. This is my body, this is my blood. But he does accept that some sort of meal happened. A send-off, if you will. He accepts the betrayal and the arrest. And he accepts the method of death as crucifixion. He makes the point that it was a Roman execution for criminals and revolutionaries, which it was. It was meant for those who, in Borg's words, were political threats to Roman order. And as a result, it was an extraordinarily painful, extraordinarily public way to die. Crucifixion was a sort of death that was meant to make an example of the one that was being killed. Don't be like that guy. It was a very powerful motivation for the behavior of the rest of the people that the Romans had control over. Look what we did to him. He was getting out of line. Now, do you want to get out of line, and do you want to end up like that? No, you most certainly don't. Get yourself in line. So it is a special in its torture. I mean, I can't think of too many other ways I would least like to leave this earth than that. But also special in its political valence. It is the authorities in power flexing their power, showing their power to the ones that they rule over, saying, don't get any ideas. He accepts the crucifixion as a method of death. He accepts that it was that it happened to Jesus as a result of this. Yeah, he was crucified as a political threat to Roman order. So, and this also lends to the next question, which was, well, who's to blame for Jesus' death? Traditionalists and skeptics like Borg have different perspectives on this. Borg, it's pretty obvious. When Borg says he's crucified as a political threat to Roman order, that means that the ones who were responsible for killing him were the ones that read his existence as a threat, which would be the Romans. Borg says the Romans killed him because he was stirring up trouble, making our life more difficult. And we already had trouble with these Jews because they're always itching for a fight and they're rebellious. They're not the easiest people to rule. So we already had issues with them. Now here comes this guy stirring up even more. Yeah, that's not going to work. He's going to have to die. So Borg says, no, it's the Romans that are responsible. He notes the fact that the Gospels shift a heck of a lot of blame onto the Jews. He also says that this is a strategic tactic by the earliest Christians because it provides them political cover. When these Christian communities form years after Jesus' death and the Romans are still in power, and they need to go to the Romans and say, look, we're not violent revolutionaries. But then the Romans say, the one you follow, we killed as a revolutionary. They can say, no, you did, that's right, but you didn't kill Jesus because he was inherently violent. You killed him because of the insistence of the Jews, the priests and the scholars and so on. You were not making a character judgment on Jesus per se. You were persuaded to do this through outside forces, namely the Jews. Obviously, the gospel accounts, particularly the Gospel of John, paints a very different picture. Lays a whole lot more blame at the feet of the Jews. Matthew has that famous or infamous line where the Jew, when Pilate is speaking to the crowd, and basically saying, this guy's blood's not on my hands, he's on yours. And the crowd responds, his blood be on our heads and the heads of our children. And Borg is absolutely right to point out that this has produced a heck of a lot of anti-Semitism over the years, with Christians persecuting Jews, calling them Christ killer, and treating their oppression, treating their persecution as kind of payback for what the Jews did to Jesus and what their descendants said. His blood be on our heads. You've earned this, in other words. So there's a lot of really ugly consequences that have come. But the traditional view as it's related in the Gospels, and the traditional view that Wright's going to defend, is that there is a reason for Jesus being killed that goes beyond the Romans getting uncomfortable. It's theological, and it is a direct result of his conflict with the theological authorities at the time, the Jewish chief priests and scribes. So it's interesting. But if you want to boil that question down to its simplest terms, you go, okay, was Jesus killed for a political reason or was he killed for a theological reason? The Gospels, right, traditionalists are going to say, well, there was a lot that was theological. He had to, in order to fulfill the program of instituting the kingdom of God, which we talked about last week. Borg says, no, it's primarily political. The Romans saw him as a threat. He was stirring up trouble. So he had to, they had to act to erase the trouble from among them. So that's Borg's basic position. Skeptical. Testing the claims of the Gospels and saying, this is weak, I don't buy this at all. Coming to a conclusion where he holds some of the things said in the Gospel as true, but he's ready to discard a lot. So here comes Wright, the traditionalist, and he's writing a chapter in response. And his basic point is, no, actually, Jesus was fully aware of what was going on. Knew that he was the one who was responsible for instituting the kingdom of God, knew that a catalytic event was needed, and that he was the one responsible to deliver that catalytic event, knew that it was up to him to fight the true battle, not against the Romans per se, but against sin, against the corruption of the world itself. That was ultimately the game that Jesus was stalking, according to the Gospels, according to traditionalist points of view. Wright points out, dramatic pause there, sorry. Wright points out that this was in keeping with first century Jewish thought. It wasn't unheard of, and remember, the world that Jesus stepped into is very important for understanding him. It wasn't unheard of in first century Jewish thought to have someone achieve victory through sacrifice and through suffering, gain victory through apparent defeat. And if you don't believe me, you should go check out the servant songs of Isaiah, because it's the clearest example. What are the servant songs? Well, that could be a whole class in and of itself. I don't have time for it. But basically, between Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 55, there are a block of what scholars call the servant songs. Isaiah's poetry, so it's really blocks of poetry and it's poetry in the form, it's prophecy in the form of poetry. But there's these passages in that larger excerpt of Isaiah which talk about the servant, and they reveal things about the servant. And the most famous servant song is what a lot of scholars call the last one, Isaiah 53. And what does Isaiah 53 say? It says, he was struck for our iniquities, he was crushed for our sin, basically. The Jewish perspective, what's wrong with the world? We are. And Christianity carries that perspective over. What's wrong with the world? We are. Sin has infiltrated the world. Sin has corrupted the world. The world is, kind of a crass way to put this, the world is the devil's playground. Here comes the servant. The servant dies. But in the servant's death, in the servant's suffering and death, because it doesn't, there is suffering involved, there is redemption, and that which was corrupted can be restored. That's the Judeo-Christian story in a nutshell, in a lot of ways. The sense of the one will come and set things right, and he will redeem what has been corrupted. Oh yeah, how's he going to do that? He's not going to do that by flexing his muscle and showing his military might. He's going to do it through suffering. So this idea of redemptive suffering was not foreign to the world that Jesus stepped into. They knew this motif existed in their line of thinking. Someone who would come and who would willingly suffer, and the world would be made better as a result. It's interesting because this is a pattern that's been put into practice ever since Jesus died, really. I'm thinking of something like the Civil Rights Movement. I don't know if I mentioned this before. Forgive me if I did. Again, my brain is basically scrambled eggs at this point. But you think about redemptive suffering, you think about something like the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to offer our bodies to you. You can turn the dogs on us, you can turn the hoses on us. But we will, and there's a Martin Luther King quote, we will win you over by our capacity to suffer. MLK was influenced in this by Gandhi, who wasn't a Christian, obviously, but history teaches that he was rather inspired and influenced by the model of Jesus when it came to this. We could talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German and Nazi, the German who suffered and died under the Nazis, practiced something very similar and wrote something very similar in his famous book, The Cost of Discipleship. This pattern of redemptive suffering, of soul force, if you will, nonviolent response to violence and oppression, it's a pattern that's been repeated. But this is probably the most famous example of Jesus meeting violence with nonviolence, but yet somehow, some way, coming out victorious on the other side. So anyway, Wright's point, this is kind of rambling, but Wright's point is that this is not unheard of in the world that Jesus steps into. He goes on, he says, well, wait, if Jesus knew what he was walking into and did it anyway, is this, in Wright's term, is it just a complicated form of suicide? Other people have asked this question in the form of, is this like divine child abuse? God the Father looks at Jesus the Son and says, go, die. Wright says, no, this is accepting the logical outworkings of your actions. He brings up Socrates. And if you don't know the story of Socrates, you should, because it's fundamental in Western thought. But Socrates was someone who was obviously ancient Greek philosopher, the ancient Greek philosopher. The way that Plato tells his story is that Socrates is brought on trial for being quote-unquote atheist. He won't worship the pagan gods that were worshipped in Greece at that time. He knows what lies in store for him, but instead of hedging his bets, instead of renouncing his previous teachings, he says, "Look, this is the way it is. You don't have to like it, but you have to accept the fact that I'm telling the truth." And they killed him for it. He drinks the hemlock as a result. Now, was that suicide? Wright says no. That was standing, accepting, sticking to your convictions and accepting the consequences that might flow from them. And he says Jesus is doing the same thing. Other people obviously have read that differently. But again, Wright is a representative of the kind of the traditionalist line of thinking when it comes to these types of questions. He answers Borg. Actually, the aesthetic challenge. Borg says, "You know what? I don't like the thought of Jesus who knew that he was going to die and went to his death anyway." Wright answers that on page 99. Trying to think if I should read it or if I should hold off. I'm going to hold off. But basically, he says, he gives a variant of the old Albert Schweitzer argument where he says, you know what, if we throw out things about Jesus that we find distasteful, we construct a Jesus in our own image. And Albert Schweitzer famously said something similar. He said, you know what, these people that are on the quest to find the historical Jesus, what they're really doing is they're looking down into a well and they're seeing the reflection of their own face at the bottom and they're saying, oh, I found Jesus. So the revolutionary says, yes, Jesus was a social revolutionary. The wisdom teacher says, oh, Jesus was a wisdom teacher. God creates humanity in his own image, and humanity returns the favor by creating God in their own image. It's a pretty common human tendency, I think. And Wright basically accuses Borg of doing this. He's like, you are in danger of not necessarily, you're not dealing with a Jesus that actually existed. You're dealing with a Jesus that you have put together to look like you and to think like you. He says that's a very dangerous way to deal, a very, very dangerous way to proceed. Obviously, Borg is going to think differently about that. That argument doesn't extend beyond. I almost wish it did because it's interesting. But he says, this is his basic reply to Borg and the traditionalist reply. So obviously, where Borg sees Jesus' death as primarily political, Wright says, no, there is politics going on, but it's interwoven with the theology of the situation. And the theology of the situation is Jesus declaring he's the Messiah, citing Daniel 7. That Son of Man guy that gets power and glory. Hello, you're looking at him. It's a theological situation that's happening. So if Jesus is the Messiah, it's a clear and present danger to the present Jewish religious authorities because they haven't accepted him. It turns into a political emergency, but it begins as a theological emergency. I am that guy, and you don't believe me. Your theology is misguided, and that's a direct threat to your politics. So he says it is political, but Wright says that does not mean even a little bit that the theology of the situation is just later Christians adding it back in. See, Borg says, the situations where Jesus has these really theological claims, it's not necessarily Jesus, the person saying that. It's the earliest Christian communities in interpreting Jesus' story, putting these theological points together, composing these gospels and writing these bits in to help explain the theological story. So we're going to talk about the Bible. We're going to talk about more sources for Jesus' life because your perspective on the Bible and how you believe it was written and why you believe it was written is going to do an awful lot to shape what you think of Jesus as a historical figure. Like if you think it's an ancient collection of myths and legends, then obviously your opinion of Jesus is going to be one thing. But if you believe it was an inerrant, inspired word of God, your take on Jesus is going to be radically different. But a lot of this, and I hope you're starting to see this, a lot of this stems on your presuppositions about the holy texts, about the Hebrew scriptures, about the Greek New Testament. And you can see the fundamental differences in the way that Borg and Wright view that material and how it shapes their views. So anyway, he says it's theological, but the theology runs into the politics. crashes into the politics of the situation, and they're intertwined. Whereas Borg says no, it's mostly political. So what was really going on? Well, if you ask right, what was really going on was that Jesus' point represents the hinge point of history. We mentioned before that sin and corruption, the view of the world, the traditionalist view of the world, is that the world was overrun by sin and corruption. That the people of the world were in bondage to that sin and corruption. The world itself, actually, if you read Romans 8, St. Paul's declaration about creation and bondage, the non-physical world was subject to that corruption as well. But when Jesus comes, he opens the door for a new period in history. A period of history where the kingdom of God gains a foothold, if you will, and will continue to expand until it completely overtakes the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of evil, if you will. Jesus' death and resurrection plants the flag for the kingdom of God, starts the process of this little, secret kingdom turning the world on its head and representing nothing less than a victory over evil. And this is the critical first step in that process. This is year zero. The revolution has happened. Restart the calendars. Everything is different now because Jesus dies and is resurrected. So again, fundamentally different from someone like Borg on this case. So that's, it's a pretty strong claim when you think about it, right? It says, when Jesus comes to die and be resurrected, it is the conquering of evil. It is the repudiation of sin. It is the end of corruption. And the astute observer would say, well, actually not so astute, the obvious observer would say, well, hang on, then why is evil still here? If this is the conquering of sin, then why is sin still exist? If it's conquering of hatred, why do people still hate each other? If it's conquering of violence, why do people still kill each other? It doesn't look like much of a victory, does it? And this is Wright's response. It's on page 105. He has a couple of very interesting things to say. Let's see if I can find the right spot. The larger story concerns the victory over evil as a whole that was won, according to the New Testament, on the cross. It quickly becomes clear, of course, why this theme is regularly, the theme of victory over evil on the grand scale, why this theme is regularly ignored. There's an obvious credibility gap between such a claim and the realities of the world. The now traditional scheme avoids this problem by projecting the victory on the one hand inward, into the heart and conscience of the believer, and on the other hand forward, into the state of affairs after death or at the end of the world. In neither case is there any outward change in the world, except in that the forgiven sinner will now live in a different manner, out of gratitude for forgiveness and in the power of the Spirit working in his or her life. This, of course, is not to be sneezed at. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful things in the world, and when God's forgiveness is then passed on by the grateful recipient, all sorts of new situations can be created, all sorts of new possibilities of healing can open up. But he goes on to say that it's not just limited to that. So what he's saying is, the traditionalists, when faced with the question of why is there still evil in the world, the traditionalist says, well, Jesus' victory, it's a spirit victory, if you will. Our hearts are redeemed, our souls are saved, and we're just waiting for the time when Jesus will come back with a lifeboat and we can get the hell out of here. We can escape this world for the pearly gates. Sounds like a fundamentalist reading of salvation, doesn't it? The whole evacuation theology. I could talk about Left Behind novels here. That whole premillennial rapture, in the blink of an eye, God calls us all home and leaves the world to basically stew in its own juices. That's a pretty traditional fundamentalist reading. And Wright says it's too narrow. He says that the victory over evil is not just something to be experienced internally. It's not something that's just going to be experienced in the future. It's something that has begun even in the here and now. How can he explain that? Well, he explains that through a concept called, which the theologians, Wright himself has called, inaugurate eschatology, which is just a fancy way of saying the already but the not yet. In Jesus' actions, has he inaugurated the kingdom of God? Yes. Will sin ultimately be defeated? Yes. But the kingdom is inaugurated, but it's not fully consummated. That comes in the second coming, and we'll get to that when we talk about theology. So basically, the victory has been won, but the full ramifications of the victory have not been made obvious yet, but they will be. In the meantime, there is power in what there is, even in the present day, real power in what Jesus has done. It just exists alongside the dying remnants of the kingdom of violence and sin and corruption. It is in the process of rooting them out, but that won't happen fully until the end of the age. So it's interesting. I mean, and this is where, Wright is the example of the traditionalist, but this is where he actually deviates a little bit from a lot of traditional understandings, because it's not the world is just hell in a handbasket and we're waiting for Jesus to bail us out and get us out of here. It is, no. When Jesus dies and is resurrected, it's a validation of the world as created. It's the physical world as good. The physical world will be redeemed. There will be true victory in every sense of the word. You just can't see it yet. So it's an interesting take. It's an area where Wright kind of drifts away from conservative understandings on this. So what happened on Easter then? We covered his death. Now you get to Easter, and Wright gets the following chapter and says, all right, now we're talking about resurrection, which is the cornerstone of this process. If Jesus just dies, then the whole thing doesn't work. He has to die and be rose again. So what does that mean? Wide range of opinions in the first century Jewish world. Wright is a historian, so his first element is to think, okay, what did that term mean way back when? Literal physical resurrection was certainly a belief held by many, but it wasn't. You couldn't find anyone hardly in first century Judaism who would think that resurrection would happen for just a single person. That one person would be redeemed. They thought it was communal. They thought it was, God is going to raise all of us at the end of history. The righteous, the wise, the true Israel, the remnant, whatever term you want to use, will be risen together and will go to claim God's world, his redeemed world, together, communally, all of us as a group. So what does that mean then for Jesus being raised by himself? How do the Christians reconcile this? Because that was, you see this in the letters of Paul in particular, where people go, well, you say that this Jesus fellow was resurrected, but how is it possible that he was resurrected by himself, but the rest of Israel, the rest of the righteous and the wise weren't resurrected yet? How does that work? And Paul responds by claiming Jesus as, his terminology, first fruits, the first sign of this larger reality. God raised Jesus from the dead. It's a precursor to the end in which he will raise all of us from the dead, and we will join Jesus, and we will be on the new heavens and the new earth together. But anyway, all of that to say, there were a large range of meanings in terms of the word resurrection, but what was the most common expectation was that it was physical, it was literal, it was bodily. Obviously, not everyone believed this. Sadducees didn't believe it, but most folks did. Pharisees certainly did. But they also believed it was communal. It was a group thing. It was Ezekiel and the dry bones, Ezekiel 37, they all come up together. That was the prevailing belief. That moves right into 1 Corinthians 15, which is a large chapter devoted pretty much to this question of resurrection. Is it physical? What does it mean? What does that look like? And in that chapter, Paul cites resurrection as a historical event. Again, the new period of history. He cites continuity with the physical body, but also discontinuity. We are the same, but we're changed. There is a sense of transformation into what Paul calls a spiritual body. And Wright defends that position of spiritual body, not as like a ghost, not as like a zombie or anything like that, but as a fully ensouled body. A body where a person, a being, where body and soul are both maxed out together, if you will. But it is physical, and there is continuity. So when you talk about the resurrection and what comes from that. Wright's perspective and the traditionalist perspective is to say, yeah, there's physical bodily resurrection. It's transformed, it's made new, but at the same time, it is what it was. Um, and in 1 Corinthians 15, it gives hope for the present day. The last verse of 1 Corinthians 15, trust in the Lord and know that your labor has not been in vain. It's not a case of God looking at the world saying, well, that didn't work, blowing the world up and making the whole resurrection truly, purely a spiritual phenomenon. It is hope for the present world, for the physical world, as well as the spiritual. And Wright is very big on this notion of bringing the spiritual world and the physical world and making them overlap with each other, which is not a common position in history. Most often the temptation is to go dualist, matter, bad, spirit, good, that type of thing. Wright doesn't want to do that. He wants to integrate the spiritual and the physical together, which is hard, and you can tell by reading his argument he's really straining, but that's what he wants to do. So Wright's conclusion is very interesting. I want to read from it briefly, just because it's interesting. He gets to the crux of the matter. He says, look, either you accept the supernatural, either you accept the miraculous, or you bend yourself in circles, looking for ways to, he basically says, when it comes to Jesus and his death and resurrection, whatever that means, he says, he basically paraphrasing him, he says, I can give you all the evidence in the world, but if you've already ruled out the miraculous, if you've already ruled out the supernatural, there's not a lot that I can say for you. You're not going to believe this. And he has a very interesting, I want to read this, sorry. Proposing as a historical statement that the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth was empty because his body had been transformed into a new mode of physicality will of course evoke howls of protest from those for whom the closed world of Enlightenment theory renders any such thing impossible from the start. But if Christianity is only going to be allowed to rent an apartment in the Enlightenment's housing scheme, and on its terms we are, to borrow Paul's phrase, of all people the most to be pitied, especially as the Enlightenment itself is rumored to be bankrupt and to be facing serious charges of fraud. The lines of historical inquiry point relentlessly inward to the first day of the week after Jesus' crucifixion. Once you allow that, something remarkable happened to his body that morning, all the other data fall into place with astonishing ease. Once you insist that nothing so outlandish happened, you are driven to ever more complex and fantastic hypotheses to explain the data. For the historian, as for the scientist, the answer should remain clear. And then he goes on to say, it is no good falling back on science as having disproved the possibility of resurrection. Any real scientist will tell you that science observes what normally happens. The Christian case is precisely that what happened to Jesus is not what normally happens. For my part, as a historian, I prefer the elegant, essentially simple solution rather than the one that fails to include all the data. So his big conclusion is interesting. He says, look, if you dismiss the miraculous out of hand, you have succumbed to the modernist project. You have succumbed to this kind of secular Enlightenment paradigm, which says, let's try to explain this event, but before we get to explain this event, let's rule the supernatural as out of bounds before we even start. And Wright's argument is, well, you can do that, but you're going to have to twist yourself in pretzels to try to explain this event and explain this person in any other way. The more simple solution, the more elegant solution is to accept that something really significant did happen. And this is kind of the conservative argument, the traditionalist argument in a nutshell. He frames it well. I just thought it was very interesting how he frames the traditionalist argument on the one hand and science on the other. I mean, there's been books and books and books and books and books written about religion and science, and do they interlap or not, or do they fight each other, or how does all that work? He is putting them as adversaries here, it seems. It's, if you go, maybe not science as much as scientism, the idea that science can explain everything, he is putting that up against the traditionalist response. He's saying, look, you try to explain all these things about Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection and and his followers that came after him. You try to explain all of that without the presence of the supernatural, without the presence of miracles. It's really hard. So yeah, so you have that the traditionalist position. Then you get into Borg's answer. Borg's interesting. He uses a very interesting image. He asks the question, he's like, could the resurrection be videotaped? Can I take a recorder and videotape Jesus' resurrection if such technology existed at the time? And Borg's answer to that is no. The resurrection narratives are a product of a developing tradition and as powerfully true metaphorical narratives. What does that mean? That means basically that the resurrection narratives, added in later by Christians who are composing Jesus' story, and the theology is kind of added on, if you will. But then he goes on to say something interesting. He says, but the truth of Easter is not at stake in this issue. How is that even possible? Borg wants to argue for a spiritual resurrection. He wants to argue that there was a resurrection, but it wasn't bodily. There wasn't Jesus' body getting out of the tomb, the stone being rolled away, all that stuff. There was a resurrection. Well, how do we know? We know it as an experiential reality. Jesus' earliest followers experienced his presence in a way that Borg is ready to call real. He says, look at, they experienced Jesus being alive, and they experienced him being Lord. They experienced him being omnipresent. It wasn't physical. It wasn't talking to someone the way that I'm talking to this camera. It was a spiritual reality, but it doesn't make it any less real in Borg's argument. On page 135, let's see if I can find here. The truth of the Emmaus story is grounded in that kind of experience, not in its being a report ultimately going back to eyewitnesses. I would extend this same principle to all of the Easter stories. Their truth, and the truth of Easter itself, does not depend on their being literally and historically factual. It does not depend upon the tomb being empty or on something happening to the corpse of Jesus. For me, the historical ground of Easter is very simple. The followers of Jesus, both then and now, continue to experience Jesus as a living reality after his death. So they experience Jesus as a living reality in the spiritual sense. This comes in the form of visions. This comes in the form of all these other things. But it's not, just because it's not physical, not just because it's not bodily, doesn't necessarily mean it's real. He goes on to say, these experiences have taken a variety of forms. They include dramatic forms such as visions and mystical experiences, and less dramatic forms such as a sense of the presence of Jesus, whether in prayer, worship, or the Eucharist, in other people, or in the dailiness of our lives. The truth of Easter is grounded in these experiences, not in what happened or didn't happen on a particular Sunday almost 2,000 years ago. Excuse me. So, Borg wants to say, look, I don't really care if the body of Jesus came out of the tomb or not. Jesus' followers experienced his presence as real. Borg says, I experience his presence as real. His followers down through the ages have done it. It may come in the sense of dreams. Jesus coming to people in their dreams. It may come in the sense of visions. It may come in the sense of just being in fellowship and communing with other people. It may come in the sense of communing with nature and finding Jesus in nature. For Borg, he says, I know that Jesus is alive, and I know that Jesus is Lord in the way in which I experience him on a spiritual level, not because someone set up a camera and found out whether the body came out of the tomb or not. Borg says that doesn't depend. My understanding of Easter doesn't depend on that. Even if someday someone turned up bones that definitively were the bones of Jesus, Borg would say that doesn't change anything. My beliefs are not based on that. It's more of a spiritual understanding of the resurrection. So the bottom line, you have Wright, the traditionalist. The empty tomb generates the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord. Why do we say Jesus is alive? Why do we say Jesus is Lord? Because we saw the empty tomb. It's a historical reality. It happened, and the gospel writers record that reality. Borg, on the other hand, reverses it. The claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord generated the idea of the empty tomb. The post-Easter followers of Jesus experience him in spiritual realities. They go to write his story, and to illustrate the reality of what they experience on a spiritual level, they tell the story of what happened on a physical level, the empty tomb, no body, and so on. Does that make sense? It's really, again, the contrast. draw is just, I think it's just gorgeous. But that's your fundamental difference between your traditionalist on the one hand and you're someone like Borg, who I don't even know what to call Borg because he's kind of a category defying, progressive maybe, skeptic. I'm not exactly sure. But the more modern perspective, there's a lot of different varieties of labels, but maybe the more conservative is the traditionalist is right, the more modern progressive mainline Borg, and you can see the differences in their perspectives. So this does raise a question, and I'm going to close here because I'm tired, and you can tell my voice is even worse than it was. If Easter is only spiritual, how is it meaningful for Borg? And Borg goes on to explain how it is. He says, there's the vindication, defeat of the powers, Jesus as the true way, Jesus is showing God's love, dying for sins, albeit in a different way than what a traditionalist would explain that. Basically, all of the stuff that a traditionalist would cite in terms of how Easter affects lives today, how Easter affects Christian lives. A traditionalist and Borg would look and go, vindication, defeat of the powers, Jesus is the only way, showing God's love, died for sin. Yeah, this list is good. This sounds right. They would be in agreement there. But the difference lies in the fact that Wright insists on making this a historical reality, he insists on making it a physical reality, whereas Borg is content to have a more spiritual understanding of the death and the resurrection of Jesus and what that means and what that entails. Does this matter? It's a huge question. I'm not going to pretend to be able to answer. But I hope you can tell just by tracking their arguments. When Borg says, I'm going to go hard on this spiritual understanding, it gives him a lot more... In some ways, it seems like Borg's job is not as hard. Because Borg can look at really problematic biblical passages and say, I don't believe it happened like that. He can look at some of the evidence and go, you know what, I don't think that is what... I think that was a later fabrication. I don't think that happened as the gospel writer says it happened. Obviously, someone like McCutcheon is going to agree with him on that. They're going to say, that's religious tradition. That's not history. Borg doesn't have as far to go in making his case. Wright and the traditionalists have a tough slog because they have to present this case, but they have to present this case. When you're arguing for physical death and physical resurrection, with the spiritual stuff tied into that, you have to work a lot harder. And this is why Wright challenges the entire Enlightenment paradigm of reason, because he has to. Because the whole business, the whole atmosphere that you and I are in 2016, they were in 2013 or whatever this book was written. The idea of a man being killed in the most torturous, painful way possible, and then a couple of days later going, "Hello, I'm fine," defies everything we've been taught. So it seems like Wright has more work to do, but he has more work to do. But if he can pull it off, I think his vision of what Easter accomplishes and his vision of Jesus' death and resurrection as the ultimate victory over evil, it's a lot more of an idealistic vision. It's a bigger vision, certainly. So it's almost like more of a risk-reward type of thing. But yeah, again, a lot of Borg and Wright here, but they're beautiful representatives of these primary points of view. The ones that look at the scriptures and go, okay, it happened basically as it said it did, and the ones that look at scripture and go, okay, we have to figure out what was history here and what was theology added in later. They're beautiful examples of that, and I hope putting them together is helping to bring this out a little bit and make it clearer in terms of some of the different ways in which these events and this pivotal figure Jesus has been viewed and how that matters when you want to talk about Christianity. So we'll continue in that vein, but until then, stay dry, and we'll talk soon.